Oh, why don't I? There it is. Okay, hi friends, and welcome to one of our identify as being meetings where we do something, a little different, in a way, quite a bit different from our usual studies of Master DK. Just to remind that our usual studies take us into, I hope you've been hearing me. I had something off here, too many buttons. Our usual studies take us deeply into the science of relations, which I consider fundamental. And I consider it even more fundamental than astrology or rheology or any of the specific kinds of interactions that we can focus upon. Relations provide for us a great generality. It doesn't make any difference what we consider to be related. We are studying differentiation. We are studying how one thing affects another, and that other affects the thing that affects it. It's kind of an interplay of a mutual influence. But what we're doing here is, as I said, it's a bit of an outlier. It's a different approach altogether. We're trying to have the kind of perception where relations themselves, though very necessary, are secondary. Relations are necessary in how we live our life after life, and universe after universe. But there is something other underlying all of that. And that's what we're trying to grasp a little bit, maybe with the heart instead of the eyes. Maybe with the single eye, which is connected to the heart, of course. There is a kind of a single eye which allows us to see everything simultaneously in the condition of non-duality. So these studies are about non-duality. And DK hints at them, of course, but he finds that it's more profitable at our stage of development to concentrate mainly on the great science of relations. I just want to welcome those of you who are, brave enough to get involved in all this. And so, with thanks to Michael Stacy for his kind of watchfulness over the whole process, making sure that we stay on our track technically, and I want to welcome Tuya and Veronica and Ann Parker and Annette, Catherine, Cindy, Georgina, Heike, Jesse, Joan, and Johi, Karen, and Leslie, Lori, and Martine, and Miro, and Nathalie, and Yvonne. Well, you are the ones who have shown up so far. And I know that this subject, in a way, can be so simple that it seems hard to grasp. It is simplicity itself. I'm recalling that Master DK told us in the Discipleship Volume 2 that simplicity opens the way into Shambhala, page 518, I believe. You know, when you have certain favorite pages, they kind of stay with you. I once had kind of an amusing exchange with a fellow student, and we just dealt with each other in terms of page numbers. We didn't even have sentences. I said to him, well, what about 518? And he'll say, well, yes, but what about page 50 in esoteric astrology? I said, well, that's interesting, but what about page 151 in esoteric healing? And on we went, kind of amused at the fact that it was easy to memorize page numbers, but of course to carry out any of this is the far more difficult thing. We have to be grateful to Master DK for outlining for us what discipleship really is. We all go through lots of stress, life after life, and are presented with circumstances which perhaps we would not like to repeat. And we witness the destruction of the things to which we are attached and which we love, only to realize eventually that nothing real is destroyed. And in even our human relations, separations come, but following those separations and the necessary detachments, DK tells us that our friends and associates are restored to us on a higher turn of the spiral. I guess we have to have a lot of faith to believe that that is so, and then experience as well. We, you know, in some of the other classes, we've been talking about the triangle of the moon sign, the sun sign, and the rising sign, representing respectively the prison of the soul and the potency of the sun of probability, which is the sun sign. We probably will follow that particular kind of energy unless we are advancing in our spiritualization, and then we enter the possibility, well, that's the word, the potency of the sun of possibility, which is the soul. We've been doing that. Now, if we take those relationships still farther, we'll find ourselves focusing on the point opposite the sun sign, and that is what we might call the monadic inlet for monadic energies in any particular life. But after all, what is the monad? And is it just a word that we throw around and we look at it as the highest aspect of our nature, or do we have any kind of even fleeting experience of this kind of oneness approached in 7 different ways that the monad can bring? After all, the word MON, you know, it pretty much means one, mono, monk, M-O-N-K. These M-O-N words, monastery, at least in English, they found their way into those meanings where you're thrown back upon your real self. And, we can assume that the self we have been dealing with is not at all our real self. It is a temporary Maya in time and space, mysteriously present, cyclically forever, says the great sage Shankaracharya, who's considered to be in a way kind of the a pair with the Buddha. He said, Shankara said, most mysterious is Maya and forever. But that forever is not a continuity. The only real continuity is the true non-myopic self. That is the beingness, Blavatsky calls it, which abides immutably forever, regardless of whether there is a universe or not a universe. A lot of these things, require the abstract mind to have some sense of what we're talking about, and even the abstract mind is not enough. Maybe this kind of straight knowledge, as Master Moria calls it, begins with the intuitive levels. Now, for another 2,000 years, he tells us, as we're entering the sixth sub-race of the fifth root race, we'll be concentrating on the abstract mind. What is it? Cultivating it. And sometimes it's called the mind of pure reason, but it's not as purely reasonable, we have learned, as the intuition is, which gives you straight knowledge without any reasoning involved. So we are beginning via the Antakarana to enter a realm which is beyond soul consciousness per se. Now, this does not mean that we have mastered soul consciousness yet. It's kind of a dual curriculum. We have to continue building in the qualities of the Temple of Solomon, building in the qualities of our soul. Yes, we have to continue doing that until the time comes when we can justifiably be liberated from that sheath, that scabbard, which holds the sword of spirit. And meanwhile, we are pursuing another curriculum of the will, which leads to the monad, to the higher triad and to the monad, with its probably unique type of perception, which in this kind of exchange that we're having together, I'm trying to bring forward, always learning more about it as you are. And of course, this is a repetitive act because in every universe, and there's only been really one player in every universe, one actor, one logos in every universe. we've had to go through similar stages of binding ourselves into a state of limited perception, only to learn and relearn, and to act out and to enter the play. The play is interesting, the word play. A universe really somehow is that, and we will reach the point of perception where we realize every universe is a play, a drama, and is play. And you get a little hint of that when DK tells us that to the master, time and space are his play things. Now, right now, we take everything really seriously, and we have to. We're deeply involved. We're deeply attached. We're the victims of Maya, the great Mahamaya, the great world illusion. We don't really know how to stand back from it the way the Buddha knew. We're not, enlightened Chohans or sixth-degree initiates who have that kind of perspective, but we're slowly on our way. When you think about it, I mean, sometimes I write down so many things I don't, know exactly what to take up. You can take up anything here, and it will all lead back to the only one thing that they talk about in the Divine Pimander, the Neoplatonist imitation, let's say, of Hermes Trismegistus, his ideas. So I just want to say the universe, any universe, and first of all, we have to accept the kind of existence of the great breath, breathing out universes, breathing them in, breathing them out and in forever, without beginning and without end. And right there, you have a big problem because it's way beyond what we can normally conceive, but we have to learn how to think always in broader and broader terms. So I'm saying the universe is any universe is, I'm calling it here, a finitized self-perception. The finitized self-perception of the supra-universal deity. Now, that's an idea that I'd like us to grab hold of. The only kind of deity that we think we can be familiar with really is the God of our planet. And then there's a whole ladder, Jacob's ladder of deities in our universe, all having wider and deeper scope until we reach the one universal deity that is essentially infinite, but in its supervision or in its play, in its drama, in its task, it supervises a finite universe made out of itself. What else is there for it to make anything out of? Basically, it's pantheism. And we know that when we read The Secret Doctrine, that Madame Blavatsky is a pantheist. That means God everywhere and in everything. Pan means all. Panton, the whole, the wholeness of things. So all the things that we see and perceive and deal with, it's all the one universal God, essentially infinite, but should we say exiled, if I can use these words and be understood, exiled, the intra-universal deity is exiled for a time into finitude. So how do I spell exiled? No, that's E-X, sorry, I-L-E-D, for a time into finitude. So we've got an essentially infinite universal logos supervising or becoming a finite system. I'll say that. The essentially infinite universal logos becomes a finite system. And that's the entirety of the differentiated universe. That's the system I'm talking about. And this, if we could only solve the problem, this has been going on forever. You know, it's a chicken and egg thing. Which came first? So basically, the universe that is coming is conceived in the mind or the self-observation of the God beyond the universe, that which is an absolutely infinite deity. See, I'm talking about two different kinds of deities here. One is intra-universal and the other is extra-universal. That's the big one. That's the supra-universal deity. And if it looks at itself, it sees absolutely differentiated infinity. It sees absolute infinity in differentiation. And the way I understand it at the moment, I always have to qualify that because, you know, I could change my mind and so could you, and we could see deeper into the whole issue. It chooses a finite portion of its infinitude and then sends it through into exile, the exile of objectivity. It sends that finite portion through, riding the ray of the absolute, the chosen finite portion of itself. I'm using, you know, strange words here. Rides the ray of the absolute into finiteness, into a finite universe. And basically, if this great deity beyond any universe did not self-perceive itself and choose, completely free choice as I understand it, choose a finite portion of its absolute infinitude, we wouldn't have any universes. The universe is the choice of a finite portion of absolute infinitude. I think maybe that's clear. At least my hypothesis here, who's going to prove this? It is an interesting idea anyway. The God beyond any possible universe sees itself as absolutely differentiated infinity, and chooses with free choice a portion to be developed in a finite system. I hate to write all that down, but that's how I see the universe coming to birth. It's a perception. And when that great deity ceases to perceive what it sent forth on this ray of the absolute, then we have Mahapralaya and the end of a universe, only to be repeated by another choice forever. And any universe you look at, it has always been preceded by an infinitude of universes. That seems to be the implication here. The great breath never started breathing. It was always breathing. Now, I'm going to try to, water this down or condense it so we actually have a little exercise here. Any universe can be perceived as a whole. That's important. As a whole, by that finitization we call the universal logos. Its essence is not finite, but its scope is finite. So it can perceive what it has become. Through emanation, the universal logos becomes a finite universe. Now let's pause on that for a minute. Through emanation, which I link to reduced self-observation, the universal logos becomes a finite universe. It's all made out of, the universe is made out of the universal logos. I mean, I'm putting it in different ways, hoping that one of them sticks for us. Any universe is made out of its universal logos through the process of emanation, which is repetitively reduced self-perception. Oh, one day we won't have to type. And even now, no, that's respectively, repetitively. Okay, repetitively reduce self-perception. So basically, the universe, any universe is the God of the universe. That's pantheism. And a lot of, people fight against pantheism. They don't think it's legitimate. It means God everywhere, basically. God, or the universal logos, is everywhere in universe. And is everything. So, there's God as a whole, the universal God, not the super universal God, but God as a whole, and it can see itself as a whole, and it can see every part that it has become. So God is the Great Spirit, this G-O-D, not the capital G-O-D, that's something different. This God not only underlies everything, but is everything. This universal, this universal God not only sees everything simultaneously in universe, but is that everything. This is maybe reasoning my way to the perception that a lot of us maybe we have and say, oh yes, I am God. Now, of course, they will, they being whoever, this is not an agreeable thought to the concrete mind. Repetitively. It's not agreeable. Many of us are afflicted by the concrete mind, and our philosophy and our religion, our understanding of who we are and all this is limited, severely limited, by the fact that we cannot think abstractly. But we're learning, and we can learn to think the big thoughts, and then eventually see the truth of those big thoughts. They're no longer just thoughts, but there's some other kind of perception, such as the higher beings have. Man is struggling. It's a fourth-rate kingdom. It's a group, a fourth creative hierarchy. It's right in the middle of everything, torn this way, torn that way. It's difficult to be a member of the number 4 of the human race in this case, but it won't always be that way. As a matter of fact, there probably we really have, beyond a certain point, the bliss of the play of the universe without being human and stuck with our attachments. We really have learned to detach, and we become Satchitananda, being consciousness bliss, or being mind bliss. And then instead of a very heavy situation like we have on this earth, this hospital we call Earth, trying to process the unredeemed substance of the moon chain, or still more, the unredeemed substance of the previous solar system, we will be liberated from that and be in a position to help apparent others undergo emancipation, liberation. That's what Master DK, in a way, he's teaching us how to do that. And the Christ's great mission is to emphasize that the truth will set us free. The truth of perception, the truth of seeing things how they are. Now, the universal logos, that's not the one that's outside the universe, really the same thing, but same being, but under different circumstances, different scope, different surroundings. Whatever that in-universe great deity has become can be simultaneously perceived. If I were, which I am ultimately, and so are you, and so is everything, the universal logos, I could perceive simultaneously what I have become. So if I were the universal logos, I'm using that 8, could simultaneously perceive all the differentiation which I have emanatively become. Now we can't do that, not yet, because our perception is severely limited. But just imagine, that you've been dropping one ring pass knot after another. And so you're not just limited by this vehicle, and your real self is beginning to pervade spaces which, the usual you is not to be found. The usual you, the real you, is going to be found. Sometimes I say, I'm just as much you as I am myself. And I think when we can get to that, I think the Christ has that, and I think some of the great beings have that. I'm just as much you as I am myself. I'm just as much that as I am this. I'm just as much that which is apparently at a distance as I am what's right here. Then we're beginning to get into the perception of the monad a little bit. So this universal logos, which essentially we are and more, can simultaneously perceive the differentiation which it has become. Okay, I don't know if I wrote that down, but the universal logos can simultaneously perceive the differentiation it has become. We can't do that yet. The human being, however, can, in a slight way, imitate this, but without simultaneous perception of all intra-universal differentiations. See, the eye, if you will, the all-seeing eye of the universal logos goes to the boundary of its self-perception. And we are within that self-perception. And we are within these millions upon millions upon millions. Even the word centillion is interesting. I think it has 303 zeros after it. And, you know, some of those big numbers are fascinating. The universal logos can see all that simultaneously, but we just see one thing after another. And I use the word see as kind of the symbol of registering or perceiving. It doesn't have to be sight, but sight takes in more of that which is around us than any other sense. You can change the different senses. You know, suppose you go to, they have them all the time, these wine tasting parties. Here are these 10 glasses of wine in front of you. Well, you know, you see them all at once, you see them, but to taste, you have to try one, then you have to clear your palate, then you have to try another. And you can move from registration of taste to another, or maybe you're smelling perfumes and you can do the same. You move from one to another. And so we have taste, we have smell, and maybe sometimes you're listening to your iPod or whatever it may be, and there's some kind of medley going on where you're going from one song to another, one note to another. But with the eyes, it's quick and faster than any of the other senses. And the correspondence on higher planes to the eyes takes in more. So we often use the term to see as if we're talking about consciousness. This moving from one thing, I'll call it from one registration, or let me call it one sensory registration to another, is useful but limiting as far as infuception is concerned. You know, like infuception, we've talked about that a lot earlier, and that's to perceive this pervading something which is the reality, not just a bunch of perceptions, but this one thing that pervades everything. That's what infuception reveals. So I'm remembering in the arcane school, you know, back in the good old days, we had a lesson set, the doctrine of the eye and the doctrine of the heart. They were two different sets, and I think there was a lot of Agni Yoga in it. And, you know, we owe tremendous to the arcane school, the Lucis Trust. It's been about 100 years now. I don't know exactly what year Alice Bailey started it, but it was in the very early 20s, 1921, 22, something in there. It's about 100 years, really. And that's the grandmother of all these esoteric schools, or the grandparent, whatever. So that was a great act of service in terms of teaching and spreading the knowledge of the ageless wisdom, and we will always be in our debt to that impulse, which Alice Bailey followed out under the guidance of her own master, Master K.H., with the help of the Tibetan. So you can move from one sensory registration to another. You can do that. And we do it all the time. You know, our eyes keep moving, mostly eyes. and all the others are slower. We can stay tuned, to auditory changes, zero in on that change, this change, the other, but the eyes are faster. We can touch one thing after another, but that's relatively slow. And yet it's one thing after another. And you'll see why I'm talking about this one thing after another in this little exercise that I hope we can do. So we're going to do it in two ways. We're going to do it with the visual sense, and then we're going to do it with that which is found on the second subplane of the astral plane, imagination. So just practice now. This will be kind of a meditation. Okay. Assuming, you're in your room or, somewhere where the computer is or the phone, or move your eyes around so that you notice one thing after another. You register it. This is what's called sequence. And it's related, this sequence of perception is related to the sense of time, to what time is. You can go very minute, or you can maybe have larger registrations. I've got in front of me a curtain that has about 500 squares in it. I could go square by square by square until I fix my attention on every square successively. I could look at my keyboard and I could go letter by letter by letter. And this is what we call a sequential movement in time, using maybe what we call the most rapid of the senses, customary senses. I don't necessarily mean the esoteric sense or anything like that. Well, it's obviously not the Gestalt, which means the whole thing. It's just parts and pieces. And that, I think, is often how we conduct ourselves in our daily life. As we walk along, or even as we sit or whatever we do, we go from one thing to another, one registration to another. This is the doctrine of the eye. This is not the third eye. This is the eye which, or the eyes which produce dualism, which, remember, we are trying to overcome in seeking to register non-duality, or to enter a state of non-duality. Now, let your eyes just kind of rest and not move. They do not, you may contain within the picture in front of you a number of things may be in your field of vision, but you don't move from thing to thing to thing. You just take in a kind of wholeness of all those things. You don't move your eyes. And you try to feel the difference. And I contend that this directs the perceptual mechanism or the ability to register. I contend that this non-movement directs the registration to what I've been calling the heart. And that it's much more likely to infusive rather than simply perceive. When you are not using the eyes as instruments of successive registration. It's much more likely that what the poet Wordsworth called something far more deeply interfused will begin to appear, regardless of what you see, regardless of what you are superficially registering. A substratum, a substance, an understanding. When you take in whatever the eyes will show you, but you don't care much about it, and you don't get particular, particle, particular, part. You don't get particular. Instead, you focus on that which pervades the scene. Now, I can redirect my eyes to another picture. I don't go from thing to thing in that picture. I keep the same substance. And everything becomes like everything else in a kind of identificatory sameness. See, the skill would be in being able every once in a while to just change the scene, but retain the substance. I'm going to put that down. now and then, change the scene, but retain the substance. Now that would be the raw fact of being. And this would be anti-qualitative perception, which is infuception. You're peeling away quality. You don't care. It can be anything, good or bad, that you register. And yet the heart identificatorily is focused on that which infuses, that which pervades. Now, instead of using your eyes, let's use our imagination, which is like an inner eye, you know, the eye of the mind. And, you know, some people close their eyes to imagine, and some people don't. Or some people do both. And encounter in your imagination different images. Of course, you know, you could do this with the other senses, but I'm sticking with the visual because it's fast and inclusive. So go from image to image. And you will discover that you have a multitude of possibilities. Who even knows what image will come up next? But they come in a sequence. Now this, now that, now the other. And there can be, you know, internally a certain speed to all this. Some people can just change images like that, and other people will be slower. It doesn't make any difference as long as you get the idea of sequence of imagined images. Some may be memories. Some may be anticipations of what apparently does not exist yet. Creative dreams or events that have occurred. And this sequence gives the kind of illusion of time. But now, just focus imaginatively on a number of things I first noticed this when I was thinking about Wesak, and I was seeing a number of the masters together. I saw them all at once, their images, all at once. I didn't move my eye around, or if I went slow enough, I could. But I realized that there was something there that was the same. I encountered sameness in my differentiated image. So choose an image which has a few things in it. It can be people, or it can be whatever. And don't allow your mind's eye to wander on to the next image. And don't even take apart the different parts of the image that you have settled upon. I could look at three people sitting on a couch, but in my mind's eye, I would not go from person to person to person. I would see it all as a gestalt. No movement of the image. And whatever differentiation of these images may be qualitatively, there is something else. The pure isness, the dimension, if I can use that word, of isness is pervading everything that you're seeing all at once. For a great logos, it's the whole universe, but for us, it might just be just a few things that we fix in the mind's eye, and it throws us into our heart, which allows us to identify with the thing that pervades every image and actually is every image. And that pervasion, pervading something, is isness, being. Being first, quality later. And if you were to add another person to the couch, long couch, let's say, doesn't make any difference what quality they bring. It's their presence as isness that counts. And gradually that isness gets so strong that it overrides any tendency to think at this moment in terms of quality. It's the non-movement of the image that allows you to go into infuception. It takes quite a bit of stillness to avoid being pulled into quality and differentiation. I'm not saying you should discount that. I mean, you have to do that, but later. For the purposes of this exercise, uh, you do that later. And now, I'm not going to do it right now, but I'm going to try to indicate that this isness, this beingness that is shared by everything you perceive, and I'm just going to say it, is yourself. Yourself as you really are, and everybody else's self too. We are pure being. And so isness becomes I-ness. I won't take us on that trip right now. It's more difficult. But I contend that this type of exercise leads us closer to identification as anything, naught is but me, says the Tibetan. And that identification is the quality of the monad. So as you go through life, you cannot help but meet, regardless of quality, which changes all the time, you cannot help but meet that which does not change, which is isness, being, yourself, the self. That, thou art, that. Or just that, that, that. When we say thou art that, we immediately introduce some kind of duality that may disappear if we just say that, 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 or say nothing at all. Oh. Okay, So that will be enough of that right now, entering back into the relative world, but it does require practice. And we hear about spiritual practices, and what I've tried to offer here is kind of a infuceptional, identificatory practice. And you can practice it as you wish, or something similar, and see what may be the result. All right. So that's all for that. And if we have any thoughts or questions, let's take a look at them. Take a listen. I really try to get this book ready for you. I've got, I think I'm calling it sort of Seeds of the Infinite, and I'm offering daily. I haven't offered today's yet, but we do have a meeting. Some seed thoughts that you can do with as you may wish, and maybe one of them will strike you in such a way that it will open a door to perception of a different kind, which I hope will be bordering on infuception eventually. So, Michael, if you'd be so kind as to take a look at what we've got.
Yes, Michael. Going back to the first seed thought that you offered today, number 351, Jesse suggests perhaps exiled should be sacrifices.
Yeah, there's different ways to approach it, and sometimes I use word for their shock value, because it's not a word you would expect to encounter. Basically, you are being exiled, why I use that word, exiled from absolutely infinite perception or infinite self-perception. In other words, I'm thinking about excommunication and all those nice old church terms. The one being riding the ray of the absolute, as it were, enters into limitation and finitude. And so in a way, sacrifice of absolute infinitude, but and an entering of the finite state in terms of self-perception, because the concentration then is upon a limited ring pass not. But essentially, the perceiver remains the essential absolute deity. It's just a temporary condition for purposes that, like, who would dare say what the purposes are? There's nothing to be gained. There's only something to be experienced through privation. In a way, the one thing absolute infinitude can do is to reduce itself. It can't get any bigger, can't get any deeper, can't get any more differentiated. It can choose, or the God that is that great differentiation of absolute infinitude can choose a finite set of relations, and then it can play. And I think, that some of the enlightened ones, they wake up, all those, happy Chinese Buddhas with who look like they've overeaten quite a bit, they seem to be quite happy. And I think they've awakened to the fact that essentially any universe is finitized play. So there may seem to be a periodic sacrifice, but then again, it's hard to think that the universal logos doesn't realize where it came from and what it's doing. See, I don't much care whatever terms a person wants to use to induce the idea that absolute infinitude becomes temporary finitude. You can call it sacrifice, you can call it exile, you can call it objectification. Choose your word, whatever is most meaningful to you. Excuse me. And there will be a lot of different words chosen, or choose no word at all and choose a symbol, or somehow just get it, just be illumined by it. And maybe you don't have to have a word, you don't have to have an image, you don't have to have a symbol, but you get it. There's been a temporary cyclic reduction for the purpose of play, if I can put it that way.
And perhaps part of the matter is the definitions that we assign to these different words.
Sure, because we do have different, if we're asked to define a word on our own without going to some authoritative source, there will be differences. So it's hard to see. All this is about identification. How do we really identify what are we essentially? And there are a lot of gradations in how we tend to identify. And that would have to be taken up on a case-by-case basis, I think. But it's always deeper and more refined and more subtle as we pursue this thing, which is doing the pursuing. Was it St. Francis that said, what we are looking for is what's doing the looking? Something like that. So you kind of, you're always trying to get behind yourself there. But we're looking for the ultimate subjectivity in the universe. And then when there's no longer that perception, that self-perception we call a universe, as cyclically happens, then we are restored to a full realization of our absolutely infinite nature, without exaggeration and without inflation. Who do you think you are? The universe? Well, okay, what are you going to do? Philosophically, you reason your way towards an identity, and better yet, you begin to experience what that identity is, which is so much more than our customarily experienced identity. Okay, lots of paths.
The next question is from Yvonne. She writes, our solar logos is ray 2. So what is the ray of the absolute?
None. The absolute has no differentiation whatsoever. It has no intelligence. It has no love. It has only an ultimatized, it is the ultimatized blank, which contains and is somehow all those differentiations which never arise within it. See, now our solar logos is a huge gulf there between a being like our solar logos, who is like a crystal to a galaxy maybe, and a galaxy which is a tiny thing compared to something else. There's a huge ladder of differentiation, and differentiation does apply to these different in-universe beings, whether it's a galaxy or groups of galaxies or arms of a galaxy or constellations or super constellations. Differentiation applies, but to absoluteness, no differentiation ever applies. It is only what it is, which is, I don't know what to, words can't do it, but I sometimes say ultimatized beingness, ultimatized beingness. That's just a human formulation of the ultimatized state beyond which there are no other states, conditions. I mean, all our words, my words anyway, are failing here. I think all human words will fail. But ultimately, for the Vedantists, when they say, thou art that, they mean that which is the absoluteness, without any number in it whatsoever. It's the absolute no thing, the zero, the absolute ever foundational, uncaused zero, which mysteriously becomes every differentiation. So, we're going to fail when we try with words. And basically coming back to the question, many things greater than the solar logos have rays or their higher correspondences, but the absolute has nothing and is foundationally everything.
Yvonne, you had your hand raised. Did you want to?
Yeah, it was confusing because it says here the chosen finite portion of itself rides the ray of the absolute into a finite universe. That part confused me.
Yeah. The ray of the absolute, it confuses me too. Something happens. In the absolute, nothing happens, okay? Nothing, because that requires change, mutation. Nothing happens, just this intensest part of pure being. So this ray of the absolute is really that which comes forth, becomes the absolute deity, one step below, these are crazy words, but one step below absoluteness, we have this super universal deity, and then it continues on what's called the ray of the absolute, rota, it continues into a state of finitude while never really changing. And that's the great paradox. The absolute never changes and yet becomes all things, including absolute infinity, while never changing. Now that's a paradox enough for anybody, I would say. And so now I understand, where you were coming from then. I think in an earlier estimation when I was writing, I did not have the step in there of the actor, namely the great superuniversal deity. I went straight from the absolute via a ray which arose in it into a universal condition. But I've since rethought that, and I do believe that the actor, who is the super universal God above any universe, whose self-reflection is absolute infinity, that actor has to be there. Because in a way, the absolute is not any kind of active actor. I think Blavatsky backs this up. Sometimes she calls it pure passivity. I would almost just have to keep my mouth shut about the absolute, because anything you predicate about it, you know, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's just going to be wrong. And yet you can kind of work around the edges to see what it is not, and by the process of elimination, you can come closer. That's called the neti method, which means not this, not that, not this, not that. You eliminate all the things that you might say about it, and maybe you're left with a better idea. Never an adequate idea, but a better idea of what the ultimatized beingness really is. You know, in the beginning of The Secret Doctrine, she's dealing with this a lot. And apparently those stanzas were provided by Master Kuthumi, and they were translated by him into English. And then she made the commentary on them. So, you know, we hear about the eternal parent who slumbered for 7 eternities and then awakened, etc. But that eternal parent, which we can call the absolute, is immutable and never in essence changes. So it is the one continuity, the only real continuity. Everything else is cyclic and is in the realm of number. This absoluteness is in the realm of the zero, or the no thing. And let's just say, you know, I'm just going to keep thinking about it until it begins to impress me as more and more understandable, while realizing I will never understand. What did she say? Beyond the reach of all thought and all word, something like that. So now I see what you meant there, and why you fastened on that, the ray of the absolute.
And so Jesse suggests that perhaps the ray of the absolute is the void.
Well, it depends on how we define void. Now, you know, the shunyata, is that it, or the Buddhist void, or we can translate it maybe as no thing, is the absolute reality itself, the absoluteness, at least in my way of thinking. The ray of the absolute is causative of a finite universe and an infinitude of finite universes. The ray of the absolute is a extension of super universal reality into a state of finitude. this is all predicated on the idea that every universe is finite. Otherwise, we would run into trouble with time. There could be no sequence of universes, as the great breath seems to imply. So I do accept the hypothesis of the great breath as the producer via what I had been calling the ray of the absolute of one universe after another. Then that ray of the absolute is retracted and returns to its source. And I would say that the super universal deity sends forth this ray of the absolute, which basically it is. It's an extension of the absolute somehow. It sends it forth, and then retraction occurs with the Mahapralaya of any universe, and all is withdrawn into absoluteness at the end of every inhalation, only to come forth again. So the void for me is a condition of beingness, and the ray of the absolute is the beginning of becomingness, we might say, which yields all the variety with which we are familiar. The variety of absolute infinitude and all the variety in any universe. I look at them as distinct in that respect. Now we can all reason our way through this and say why we believe what we believe. And I suggest it for everybody. As we come up with a hypothesis, why do we think so? I think that would be a productive way of proceeding.
Georgina writes that there is so much to learn and asks this question: does the soul have a sense of finiteness of itself?
Yes, in my view. The soul is definitely a finite entity, at least when we're talking about the human soul, that consciousness as encapsulated in the causal body or egoic lotus on the higher mental plane. But the soul also knows that in essence, it is the consciousness aspect of the universal God. And the universal God, universal logos, knows that in essence, it has been sent forth into finite objectivity, but that really it is in essence the absolute deity itself. And the absolute super universal deity knows within itself that there is not ultimately but continuous, beginningless, endless absoluteness. Now, of course, I'm speculating. What else can we do with our limited human minds facing subjects of this nature? But what we normally call the soul is definitely a finite encapsulation of consciousness. But the term soul is really a universal term, meaning consciousness, and there are ever more expansive versions of soul as we rise towards the universal God, whose consciousness of itself is soul in the highest in the universe sense. But beyond that, a universe has to disappear. And the consciousness aspect still exists within the super universal deity after the universe has disappeared. Basically, the whole universe is just a question of self-consciousness of this very great above the universe type of being. Now, when it comes to absoluteness, into which all Maya is absorbed, I can only say, who is to say? Who is to say? Except that it has no cause, it always has been, there's nothing additional to it, really, than what it is. It need not be caused, it just is. And the intensity of its beingness is so great that it basically is every other possible thing without having such things arise in it through numbering. There's no numbering going on in absoluteness.
And Joan is referring to this conversation perhaps as the elephant in the universe.
Yeah, yeah, that's, does anybody notice the elephant in the room, you know? The big white elephant in the room. In a way, it's so blatantly, simply present that it fails to be cognized. It fails to be registered. Now, you know, we all have to develop our own language about these things. All I'm doing is sharing with you something I've been thinking about for I guess about 30 years, in a serious way. I've been thinking on and off about it for a lot longer than that. You know, maybe almost 60 years, or at least 50 something years. And do I feel that I am closer now to understanding the real meaning of the words I'm using or inventing? I do. And yet, it's so, I know that we're going to have to wait until our ring past knots, or rings past knot, really start to break down, and we become members of higher hierarchies before our perception of these matters becomes really real, or more and more real, or more and more real. I just patiently know that in the present situation, I can offer reasoned speculation and some experience, which I trust will improve in the nature, in the intensity of its reality as man becomes more than man, or re-becomes more than man. Yes, there's a lot to learn. And a lot of that learning is in the great science of relations, which the Tibetan teaches us superbly in Cosmic Fire and other books. And then this is another approach coming out of ancient India and even before, obviously it's all part of the shambolic wisdom in Atlantis and even Lemuria. It belonged to the initiates of the time who were not as advanced, let's say, as the initiates of the present time, but it belonged to them. Just turn to page 284, 285 in Discipleship in the New Age, volume 2, and you'll see 6 thoughts which are the seed of all philosophy. And they're older than the stanzas of Dzyan. And they were used to achieve the third initiation in bygone days. They're really worth reading, and maybe we'll we'll do that together. They say God is, time is, space is. You may have remembered what it's all about. It's a great 6 sentences.
And then Jesse adds, doesn't the void contain all? Perhaps the soul is a communicator between higher mind and the physical being as it relates to man.
Well, that is one thing the soul is, what you just stated. And the soul is consciousness. It is the relation between the observer and the observed, and is also a universal principle. So there is the instance of what soul is for man, and then there is universal soul, and maybe Blavatsky and Emerson called this the oversoul. And the 3 fundamentals of the secret doctrine, which we do have, the third one says that all souls are identical with the oversoul. Really, there's only one consciousness in all of universe, and beyond that, there's only one consciousness in super universe. The void, to me, depends on how you want to define it. It's pretty much, I think, what suchness is to the Buddhist or to the Buddha. And it is the ultimate reality. It's only void of specificity. It's void of number. It's void of differentiation. But it is infinitely full of its selfness, if you will. Whatever it is, it's infinitely full of that, whatever that is. So soul can be a relative term, and then it is indeed the mediator between classic, our classic theosophy, mediator between monad and personality. It can be a universal term. It's always the middle principle. And it is ultimately the consciousness of the universal logos. And if we want to take it further, the super universal deity has being, has soul, and has its own internal nature, which is observed as object. So the word soul might even be applied beyond the universal condition into the super universe. However, in absoluteness, there is no perceiver. Being itself subsumes or takes on or becomes any differentiation you can think of. Soul, intelligence, love, whatever the great principles, being condenses all of them and is all of them without dividing them into perceiver, perceived. That would be to introduce number into the absoluteness, but it is the realm of no number, as Blavatsky says, the realm of zero, the realm of absolute zero, the realm of no thing. Anyway, that's the way I see it.
We've been through all the questions and comments that have been given in the chat box, and there are no hands currently raised.
Okay, well, that summarizes it then. And good, we're just about on time. Everything, what did I say I was going to take up next time?
And then Ann Parker just wrote.
Okay.
Could one say then that in detachment, nothing is lost because all is contained in absoluteness?
In detachment, this is so important, some of us with the sign Cancer in our horoscope, we really, in the Jafra paintings, the big claws of the crab, we hang on to what is near and dear. I certainly know that with Cancer rising and so forth. But DK is constantly emphasizing that nothing is lost. And not only will we be reintroduced to those we love on a higher turn of the spiral, but we actually become that which we have been attached to. So there's seeing, that's consciousness, and then there's being, seeing and being, I always think that being is a higher order of things and includes perception. We don't even have to go so far as, like beyond the universe kind of thing. We simply have to get into our more essential nature, which is triadal, even, and finally monadic, in order to be fully the very ones and the very ones to which we have been attached, and the very things to which we have been attached. We'll discover that we actually are essentially those people, those things. And this is monadic identification. What I want to say is you just can't lose yourself. They say lose yourself and find yourself. Yeah, that's a lower self. You cannot lose the self. You cannot lose what you forever are and what everybody else forever is. It can't be lost. There's no place for it to go. It's just waiting to be realized as ever we have realized it in these successive universes. So, I'm always amused. I was in Ojai, and they're near that, maybe in Ojai, but is the place where Meyer Baba, maybe he was called the Silent Saint, I don't know, he was Pisces, I think. And he was silent for 30 years. That's a long time not to talk, Who knows what's going on inside? There's external silence and then there's internal, but one cannot pretend to know that. But then when he broke his silence, he just said, don't worry, be happy. This was like the summary of what he wanted to communicate to people when he broke his silence. So somehow it's important to know there is no loss. There is loss, apparent loss, within the forms of the great illusion, the Mahamaya, but there is no real loss because the self, which is all there is, cannot be lost. Even the word lost would not mean anything because it implies division. There's here and there. Now you have something, now you don't. Now you can find something, now you can't. That you would enter the realm of duality, which is not real. Okay. Is that it then?
Last thing from Jesse, all always is.
Yeah, that's a good one, and that is true in a super universal sense, because think about absolute infinitude. It cannot be, use ungainly words, crammed into any universe, and yet in its super universal state, all forever and always is. So far, the only contradiction I can come up with is that the only impossibility is that the absoluteness is not. That's why Spinoza, when he wrote his Ethics, he had 6 sentences that kind of set off the whole book. And he said that that God admits of no negation. So the only possibility, which I think does not exist, is the non-existence of the one existence. So all always is in a super universal state, I believe to be correct. Okay. So we're just about there, and let us, tomorrow morning, let's see, what is it? I think it's, but this is night, isn't it? I think so. And so glamour tomorrow morning, the dissipation of glamour, and we're really going to work on manipulation again. When you, coming right back down into the world of relativity here, when you see the manipulations that are in process to preserve unrealities, basically, you have Master Moria calling the lower ego a ball of fat. That's what he calls it, And to think of being identified with that lower ego and manipulating all circumstances so that that lower unreality becomes exalted in some way, it's a crime. And so we'll keep on trying to undermine and dissipate this constant manipulation going on the governmental level and also in church levels, constant manipulation that leads to everybody's unhappiness and an unfair condition. I think we have to stick with that almost until we have to stick with that because the manipulations will become more intense I know that the USA is certainly not the world, but it's falling fast, and it can set a very bad example for other dictators, would-be dictators. So that's what we're going to be meditating on, the glamour of manipulation again. And I may just keep that going for a while so that we have a strong emphasis on that. And then at night, we'll have the cosmic fire in depth. Alrighty, great invocation.
Michael, do you want to change your screen share?
Only if people don't know the great invocation, like me, when I forget the third or fourth verse. Is that better? From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into the minds of men. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into the hearts of men. May Christ return to earth. From the center where the will of God is known, let purpose guide the little wills of men, the purpose which the masters know and serve. From the center which we call the race of man, let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. Well, thank you, everybody. And we'll be seeing you, if you can make it, for the glamour dissipation and for cosmic fire. And let's concentrate during the coming month and a half as powerfully as we can on the practical welfare of humanity, because as we all know, there is an attack going on, and we can feel it, and that attack has to be neutralized. We can't do it all, of course. The masters are working on it, but we can do something. So, many blessings and lots of love, and we'll see you before long. Now I'm going to pause. I'm going to turn off the recording. And